As you've heard on Bridge City News, the Liberals won a minority government, even though the Conservatives won more of the popular vote. But what mattered most is the Liberals took the most seats. One of our regular political contributors, Brian Lilley, joins me once again from Toronto. Brian, you called for a Conservative minority, but the Liberals snuck in. What happened?
Well, everybody got it wrong, and we can, speak more in depth about the polls later on. But what happened was the NDP vote was not there. The Liberals had a great ground game in Ontario. A lot of what people had been predicting in the Atlantic provinces, in Quebec, across Western Canada, including straight into BC, where it was a three and sometimes four-way race, that all played out. But nobody predicted, or few predicted, that the Liberals were going to come away with just one seat less than they won in 2015. You remember, 2015 was a bit of a wave election. The Liberals came from third place to take 184 seats, and that included 80 in Ontario. At my last count, there were 79 seats that they took. That's more than they had when Parliament, broke for the election. So, it was a gain for the Liberals in Ontario, and the Conservatives couldn't deliver. In fact, even popular former cabinet ministers, deputy leader of the party, Lisa Raitt, going down in defeat. An awful lot of other candidates that had high hopes going down in defeat as well. So a big night for the Liberals, a bad night for the Conservatives, and a disappointing night for the NDP. Great, though, if you're the Bloc Québécois leader.
Brian, there's more Alberta separation sentiment setting in now that Trudeau and the Liberals are back in. You recently wrote about this. Is the noise that's coming from the prairies being heard in central Canada?
Well, it's being heard by some people and dismissed by others. I don't understand how people in central Canada, who are often so attuned, right here in Ontario, people start talking about Quebec separatism. They get very worried. They're concerned about national unity. Let's do what we can to keep Quebec in. People in Alberta and Saskatchewan are upset. Oh, to heck with them. Let them keep their oil. We don't want it. Well, they seem to want the oil money. And in fact, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, in a letter that he sent to the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Trudeau, on Tuesday, day after the election, said just that. Let me read you just one line from this 5-page letter. He says, Albertans cannot understand why they have been called on to contribute $20 billion more annually to the government of Canada than they receive back in benefits, and yet our ability to develop that wealth is increasingly blocked through cancelled and killed pipelines and policies like Bill C-69. And of course, Trudeau's star candidate out of Montreal, Stephen Guilbeault, former Greenpeace activist, says there's not going to be any more pipelines, not even Trans Mountain. That's not compatible with their goals for 2030. So some people are getting it, some people are not. The alarm is being sounded. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says there's a prairie fire burning that Trudeau needs to put out. And in his letter says, I've given you the fire extinguisher. Look after our concerns. But I'm not sure that the people in power will get that. And I'm definitely convinced that the coalition partners that Justin Trudeau is going to have to look for will not get that. They believe no more pipelines, leave the oil in the ground.
No more pipelines with Bill C-69 is giving rise to a lot more of the sentiment of Western separation, especially here in Alberta. So, Brian, what do the election results mean for the federal party leaders? Will Trudeau, Scheer, or Jagmeet Singh see challenges to their leadership?
Well, Justin Trudeau definitely won't, even though he did lose almost 30 seats from the last election result, 184 down to 157. That's a significant drop. He also dropped about 6 percentage points in terms of the popular vote across the country. This is the government. My understanding is this is the government that has had the lowest percentage of the popular vote ever, and yet is still able to hold on to power, just due to weird seat splits in Ontario and how things went down. So Justin Trudeau is going to be safe. Had he lost power, there probably would have been rumblings for him to go. Andrew Scheer is going to face an automatic leadership renewal review. Will he survive it? I don't know. Some knives are already out for the Conservative leader, and some people are saying, well, if we just elect a more moderate leader, then we would win. I don't buy that. You can be the most moderate Conservative ever. Once you are threatening to take power from the Liberals, you will be described, could have been Ron Ambrose, could have been Peter MacKay, could have been anybody. They would still be described as a far-right, fire-breathing, social conservative dragon that must be slayed to save the country. They would have run the same campaign against them. Maybe a different leader would have had a better chance communicating but it would have been the same campaign. They do it to Doug Ford in Ontario all the time, and he's not socially conservative. So that's my advice to the party if they decide to dump Scheer. That could happen in the next couple of months. Jagmeet Singh, believe it or not, despite going from 39 seats down to 24, New Democrats are saying this is a win. The guy's expectations, because he'd been such a bump on a log until the campaign began, nobody had high hopes for him. And so 24 seats, even though he lost all but one of the 14 he had in Quebec and didn't do as well as expected in places like British Columbia, this is a win. Only in NDP land is going from 39 to 24 seats a victory.
The federal Tories went up or held steady in every region of the country except for one, Ontario. Brian, was it really the Ford factor?
I think the Ford factor was definitely part of it, but not in the way that a lot of people think. There's been this push to say that Doug Ford was scaring off moderate voters and conservative voters, and when you look at the percentage of the vote that Scheer was able to get in Ontario across the province, it was about 33%. You go into some other areas like Oshawa, where the GM plant is, made the news quite a bit over the last year. That was about 39% voting for the Conservatives. And towards Eastern Ontario, the same thing, high 30s, low 40s in terms of support. But in Toronto in particular, and in that mythical 905 belt, there were a lot of people on the progressive side who were looking at the NDP and decided, we're going to move. Why did those vote splits go the way they do? In my view, two reasons. The NDP surge that happened, that put them up to 15 to 20%, depending on the poll, kind of broke in two ways because they only got about 16% of the vote. I would say about half of that extra didn't show up. They just didn't bother going to the polls. The NDP didn't have the resources. We talk about getting out the vote, how important this is to parties. The Liberals were very good at getting out their vote, in particular in Ontario. That means knocking on people's door at dinner time and saying, have you voted? Hal, can I take you to a polling station? Calling you until you say, look, I voted already. Leave me alone. That's what it takes. The Liberals did very well. The Conservatives, okay. The NDP didn't have the resources. The other part is the other half that had been part of this, I'm going to vote NDP, but then didn't. I believe that they folded in behind the Liberals as part of a Stop Scheer campaign. So the harping on Doug Ford may not have scared away people that voted Ford the last time, but it did scare people that voted NDP provincially and said, I don't want to go for that again. I'll vote Liberal this time.
So, Brian, Justin Trudeau is back in with the Liberals, with the government, the minority government. What does this really mean for the fight over the carbon tax with the various provinces? Catherine McKenna has already said the federal levy will be brought into Alberta in January.
Jason Kenney, the Alberta Premier, is still saying that he's going to fight it. And of course, he's been supportive of Ontario and Saskatchewan's court case. Those cases will go on. Blaine Higgs from New Brunswick had said that he was going to fight it, but he's been waffling ever since. At one point, he was going to launch his own court case. Then he said he wouldn't. I can't remember if he joined with Saskatchewan or Ontario's case, but now he's saying, well, I'll find a different way to charge emitters. And so he's looking at a different model. Ontario's Doug Ford had said, look, this case is going to be decided at the polls, not at the courts. He said that at the end of August, and a lot of people took that to mean that if the Liberals won, he would just give up. I took it to mean, hey, the Conservatives are going to win, and we won't have to deal with this anymore. The Conservatives did not win, and the Liberals did very well in Ontario. But still today, his office saying that, we're continuing to have discussions, but the court case will go on. So 2 court cases so far. We'll see if Jason Kenney in Alberta launches a third court case. Those are all headed to the Supreme Court, should be heard within the next year.
Elizabeth May and the Green Party did not have the big breakthrough they were looking for. The People's Party as well, they didn't even win a seat, including their leader, Maxime Bernier's. Brian, does that mean potentially the end of the PPC?
It does potentially mean the end of the PPC. They don't have a single representative. And, I'm sitting not far from one of the seats that they claimed they had the potential to win, Etobicoke North, because the sister-in-law of Ontario Premier Doug Ford and the widow of late Toronto Mayor Rob Ford had agreed to run for them. But I still don't think Renata Ford got above 3% of the vote in that riding. So, they really didn't have a shot. Maxime Bernier was their only legitimate shot. and he lost his seat in the Beauce region of Quebec at South Quebec City along that Quebec New England border. I believe it borders mostly with Maine. He lost that seat handily. It was more than 10 percentage points separating him and the new MP for the area, Richard Lilley. Uh, that is shocking. And it wasn't because there was a second guy named Maxime Bernier running. If you remember, the Rhinoceros Party, in a bit of mischief, found another guy in Quebec named Maxime Bernier and had him run in the riding. Even if you added both their votes together, they still would have lost. The Bernier name has been synonymous with that riding for a long time. Maxime himself has held it since 2006. His father held it for years before that. So this is a big loss for him and his party, and I think there's a good chance that they will fade away. If not, they'll probably just remain on the fringes.
Now, Brian, you wrote a lot about polling with the Toronto Sun. You spoke with various pollsters all throughout the campaign. How can so many people get it so wrong? And should we ever believe anything that the polls have to say?
I still think that polling is a valuable tool, especially during elections, and it tells you where trends are going. But none of them are bragging today. I was the most accurate pollster. In the past, they have been able to get it within a percentage point or even less in terms of the popular vote breakout of various parties. This time, there were polls going in right up until the end saying it's a dead heat. It's tied. It's 31-31. And of course, it ended up at about 34 and a half for the Conservatives and 33 for the Liberals. So it wasn't a win at all for pollsters. But again, I think it was how that NDP vote broke out, because the NDP did a lot worse than people were expecting. And as I said, I think half of them that said they were going to vote NDP but didn't, they just didn't show up at the polls, and the other half decided they were going to back the Liberals. I think that's what it all comes down to, but there's going to be an awful lot of hand-wringing by the polling community and an awful lot of soul-searching to say, okay, did we miss a wave this time? One last mention of polls. Darrell Bricker of Ipsos said that they did, I think it was around 10,000, 9 to 10,000 people did an exit poll with them after they voted. And 7% said that they'd made up their mind in the ballot box. And an awful lot of them said they went in thinking, I'm leaning towards Jagmeet Singh in the NDP, and they came out having voted Liberal.
Brian, SNC-Lavalin shares shot up, so obviously the markets think the Liberal win is good for the company. Does this potentially mean a deal is happening?
Well, obviously, the markets think a deal of some sort will happen. Will it be a deferred prosecution agreement? Will they change the law to allow the company to continue to bid on federal contracts, even if they're found guilty? I don't know. The Liberals have never taken it off the table. Even with all the controversy surrounding that earlier in the year, they never took that possibility off the table during the election. And in fact, the Prime Minister even said during the, I believe it was the English language debate, I watched all three. Actually, I watched all four. I believe it was the English language debate, though. He still claimed that the Globe and Mail story, the original one, was false. He'd admitted previously that it was, after much investigation, he admitted that it was true, but it was okay. They changed their tune and were doubling down. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a deferred prosecution agreement. But I bet we'd have to wait a couple of months to find that out for sure.
One more thing I want to chat with you about. Jane Philpott out, Jodie Wilson-Raybould in. Your thoughts? Any surprises there?
No, that's exactly how I expected it to go in terms of which of the two women running as independents would win. Jane Philpott was in a tougher race because the Liberals put up an experienced Ontario cabinet minister who'd been elected in that very area for many years at the provincial level. The Conservatives had won that riding many times, and they had high hopes that, okay, if Helen Jassic, who they brought in as their candidate for the Liberals, split the vote, the Liberal vote with Jane Philpott, while the Tories would walk up the middle and take the riding back. They'd only lost it in 2015. That didn't happen. The Liberals still won there. But Jodie Wilson-Raybould had a lot of support from across the country. She will now potentially be a thorn in the side of the Trudeau government. But I also do expect that on most things, she's going to vote with them still.
But what's interesting is the fact you've got an independent candidate there, but they don't have a party backing them. So what kind of clout or power will she actually have in Ottawa?
Not a lot. Independents generally don't. Elizabeth May's been there a long time. She doesn't get to speak all that often. She doesn't get committee appearances. She doesn't get to chair committees. They will occasionally allow independents to sit in and ask questions, but they're not allowed to vote. So it's going to be difficult for her to make her voice heard. And we'll see if voters return Jodie Wilson-Raybould if she decides to run again the next time we go to the ballot box, which could be in a couple of months, could be several years from now. We'll have to wait and see.
One of our regular political reporters, Brian Lilley, joining me once again from Toronto. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you, Hal.